In the heart of a dense forest, where the towering pines whispered with every gust of wind and shadows clung to the land like ghosts, there was an untouched corner of the world, a wildlife sanctuary so remote that only the occasional hiker or conservationist ventured close, if ever. It was a place where nature unfolded without human interference, where the creatures roamed freely, living lives their ancestors had lived for generations. The forest stretched endlessly, its expanse interrupted only by the occasional rocky outcrop, trickling stream, or narrow trail that wound deeper into the unknown. And there, on the edges of a forgotten valley, was the one place the sanctuary's rangers had always kept an eye on. A clearing dotted with thick grasses and dense underbrush, where a lone cow had appeared. It wasn't supposed to be there. Cows weren't native to the area, nor were they part of any known herd that roamed the sanctuary. And yet this cow, a dark, scraggly beast with patches of matted fur, had wandered into the clearing and stayed there, day after day, barely moving, its eyes fixed on some unseen point deep within the woods. Its presence unnerved the rangers, but none dared approach it too closely. They simply watched, studied, and made notes in their logs. There was something unsettling about the cow's stillness. It wasn't normal for any animal to remain in one place for so long, especially one so large. It wasn't grazing, it wasn't drinking from the stream, it wasn't even sleeping. Instead, it stood there, staring into the heart of the forest, as if waiting for something. A ranger named Callum, a man who had grown used to the wilderness, was the first to suggest that something more was at play. He had been coming to the sanctuary for years, having been drawn to its raw beauty and the serenity it offered. But recently, his nights had been disturbed by strange sounds, rustling beyond the usual animal calls, soft scraping noises, and a low thud that seemed to echo through the trees at times. He could never pinpoint where it came from, only that it was out there, in the deepening shadows. One evening, as dusk began to settle over the forest, Callum decided to investigate further. He knew the risks. The sanctuary was full of predators, and after nightfall, the forest could be unforgiving. But his curiosity gnawed at him, and the eerie stillness of the cow only heightened his suspicion. With nothing more than a flashlight and a thick coat to ward off the chill, Callum ventured into the clearing. The cow was there, just as it had been every day, unmoving, staring into the trees. Callum felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he approached, but there was no sound from the animal, not even a rustle of movement. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cow's dull, almost lifeless eyes. They were wide, glassy, and unblinking, as if fixed on something beyond his reach. As Callum stepped closer, the underbrush around him rustled. A twig snapped. He froze, listening. The forest was still, too still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of night creatures. Just silence. He dared to move closer, reaching out with a gloved hand to touch the cow's side. As his fingers brushed its coarse fur, a jolt ran through his spine. There was warmth, but also an unnatural coldness beneath the surface, as if the cow's body was hollow. A sudden movement in the shadows behind him made Callum whip around. The sound of hooves, faint but unmistakable, sounded from somewhere deeper in the forest. He strained his eyes, but all he saw was darkness. His pulse quickened. Another sound followed, a soft shuffle, then a distinct, dragging step. Callum knew he should leave. The unsettling feeling in his gut urged him to retreat, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He turned back to the cow, its unmoving form growing even more unnatural in the harsh beam of his light. That's when he saw it. A dark shape emerging from the edge of the trees. For a moment it was hard to make out what it was. It seemed large, almost cow-like. but its movement was too erratic, too unnatural. The shape glided in and out of the shadows, shifting like smoke, and then there was a sudden, violent thud as the thing dropped into the clearing. It was another cow, but it was not a living cow, at least not in the sense Callum understood. The beast before him was mangled, its body contorted in impossible ways, limbs bent at wrong angles, fur matted with dirt and blood. But there was something about its eyes, wide and alert, yet somehow hollow. It, too, was staring into the depths of the forest, just as the first cow had done. Callum's heart pounded as he stumbled backward, his flashlight dropping to the ground. The light flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The air grew thick with an unnatural humidity, heavy with a sense of dread. The hooves stopped, and all was silent. Seconds felt like hours as Callum stood frozen, fear gripping him. The thing, whatever it was, moved, slowly at first, and then in an instant it was gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had come. He wanted to run, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His feet felt as though they were glued to the earth, and the only sound now was the heavy thumping of his own heartbeat. Suddenly, a piercing cry split the air, a cry that was unmistakably human. It was coming from the forest. The cow turned, its head jerked violently, its eyes wide with terror as it faced the sound. Callum didn't need to see it to know the sound wasn't human. It was the sound of something caught between worlds, a tortured wail of something far older, far more malevolent than anything he'd ever encountered. He finally broke free from his trance and bolted from the clearing, not looking back. The woods seemed to close in on him, branches grasping at his clothes as if the forest itself didn't want him to leave. When Callum returned to the ranger's station, breathless and wide-eyed, he couldn't explain it. No one believed him. The cow was gone, the clearing was empty, the strange sounds had ceased, leaving only the dense, unbroken silence of the forest. Days passed, and Callum couldn't shake the image of the twisted cow, the sound of hooves dragging through the underbrush, or the chilling wail that echoed in his ears. He tried to write it off as a nightmare, a hallucination. But one thing haunted him more than anything: the presence of the cow, staring into the depths of the woods, waiting for something. And deep in the forest, in the forgotten places where few dared tread, something waited still. As the days turned into weeks, Callum found himself unable to forget what he had witnessed. The quiet of the forest now felt heavy, oppressive. The towering trees, once majestic, seemed to loom over him with a hidden knowledge, as though they were silently watching his every move. The air felt thick with secrets, and each creak of the branches above sent a ripple of unease through his chest. The rangers, accustomed to strange occurrences in the wild, simply chalked up Callum's experience to the stress of the job. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, they suggested, a deep exhaustion from long hours and isolation. They laughed it off, but Callum knew better. He could still hear that wail echoing in his mind, the sound of something ancient and unknowable, far worse than any storm or creature the forest had ever thrown at him. It was only when he began walking the trails near the clearing again, driven by an inexplicable pull, that he started to notice small things. The silence, the eerie absence of life that had followed him after his encounter, was now interrupted, not by the usual calls of birds or rustling of small creatures, but by subtle, almost imperceptible sounds. The snapping of twigs when no one was around, a distant, faint clinking, like the sound of chains dragging through the forest floor, and the faintest murmur, barely audible, as if the trees themselves were whispering. Callum couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. One evening, just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, he ventured into the clearing once more. His heart raced in anticipation, not knowing what he would find, but feeling deep within himself that he had no choice but to face whatever haunted that place. The trees surrounding the clearing were still and quiet, their trunks dark silhouettes against the fading light. But something was different this time. There, standing in the middle of the clearing, was the cow. The same cow, still unmoving, still staring into the depths of the forest. But now it seemed even more unsettling. Its body was gaunter, more skeletal, its ribs jutting out beneath its fur, which was now a sickly gray. The unnatural stillness that had once been eerie now felt dangerous, like a predator poised to strike. And then, from the shadows beyond the clearing, something moved. A figure, distorted and limping, staggered toward the cow. It was a man, or something that had once been a man, wrapped in tattered clothing, face obscured by long, matted hair. His movements were slow, dragging, as if each step required enormous effort, each one a struggle against some unseen force. The sound of his footsteps, heavy and labored, broke the silence like a crack in the stillness. Callum's breath caught in his throat. The figure was walking toward the cow, the same cow that had been staring into the woods for days, and now, as Callum watched, it seemed to shift in place. Its eyes no longer held that vacant, distant look. They locked onto the figure with an unsettling intensity. The man, or whatever he was, reached out a trembling hand toward the cow, but just before their hands met, the air seemed to tremble, as if some unseen force had rippled through the very ground beneath their feet. Callum's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. The cow's body stiffened, its once hollow eyes now filled with an unnatural glow. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, an invisible tension that hung heavy in the atmosphere. The man recoiled, as if struck by an unseen force. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with terror. The wail returned, louder this time, echoing from deep within the forest. But it wasn't the cry of a creature. No, this time it was unmistakably human, the scream of someone in agony, caught between life and death. The cow's body began to twitch, its limbs jerking in a grotesque, unnatural way, as though it were no longer a living creature, but something else. Callum stepped forward, unable to tear his eyes away from the spectacle. His feet, however, were reluctant to move. He was rooted to the spot, frozen by the strange magnetic pull of the clearing. The man gasped, his eyes wide with shock and fear. His lips moved, but there was no sound. It was as though he was speaking to something beyond him, something far more ancient and powerful than any of them could comprehend. And then, as if the forest itself had heard his plea, the cow lunged forward. In a flash of movement, the cow's form twisted into something entirely different. Its body expanded, its limbs elongated, its shape warping into something monstrous. What had once been a simple cow was now an abomination, its flesh bubbling and contorting as if it was being pulled apart by invisible hands. The man cried out, but his voice was drowned by the deafening roar that filled the clearing. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. The forest fell silent once more. Callum blinked, unable to believe his eyes. The cow was gone, leaving only a faint mist in the air where it had stood. The figure, too, had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the weight of his absence and the strange, lingering feeling of something unfinished. But the air felt different now, thicker, heavier, as though the forest had shifted in some profound way. The trees seemed closer, their shadows deeper, and the distant wail that had plagued Callum's mind for so long was now gone. But the presence of something unearthly still lingered in the air, a presence that would never leave the clearing. Callum could feel it in his bones. And as he turned to leave, to escape the oppressive weight of what he had just witnessed. He caught one last glimpse of the clearing, just beyond the trees. Where the light had all but vanished, he saw something. A pair of glowing eyes, staring back at him from the forest's edge. The forest was watching. It was waiting, and it would never forget. The chill that crept down Callum's spine felt colder now, more deliberate, as though the forest itself was responding to his every thought, every movement. The eyes, those glowing, unnerving eyes, stayed fixed on him from the shadows, unwavering, unblinking. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were something else. His breath quickened. He wanted to run, but his legs felt stiff, rooted to the ground as if the very earth had claimed him. The weight of the forest seemed to press against him, its silence deafening, yet full of something unspoken, something ancient. Callum swallowed, forcing his feet to move, but each step felt heavier, like wading through thick, invisible mud. The trees seemed to part just enough for him to pass, but the presence behind him never wavered. It followed him, step for step, though he could never quite see what was out there. By the time he reached the forest's edge, his mind was clouded with dread. The sky, once vibrant with the colors of sunset, had turned a sickly shade of gray, the clouds swirling with a quiet menace. As he stepped out of the trees and back into the open, the air seemed to clear, though the sense of being watched remained. But something was wrong. The clearing, the place where he had seen the cow, the place where it had twisted into something inhuman, was no longer where it had been. Callum blinked, feeling disoriented. The landscape had shifted in a subtle, disconcerting way. The trees were closer, their trunks thicker, their branches more entwined, as though they had grown while he was inside. The path, once familiar, now seemed unfamiliar and distorted, as if the forest had folded in on itself. Panic gripped him. Was he lost? The sound of rustling leaves snapped him back to reality. He whirled around, his heart in his throat. But there was nothing. The forest was still, silent once again. But the unease that settled in his chest refused to dissipate. The eyes were still there, somewhere deep in the shadows, watching him, always watching him. Callum's breath quickened as he turned toward the distant horizon, desperate to escape, to make it back to the ranger station, to something that felt safe, familiar. But as he moved, the unease grew. The rustling sound returned, louder this time, closer. He stopped, his body frozen, his ears straining for any sign of movement. There, just beyond the tree line, he saw it again. The faint, eerie glow. The eyes. But this time they weren't alone. Out of the shadows, a shape emerged, slow and deliberate, like a shadow shifting in the dim light. It was a figure, a silhouette against the backdrop of the darkening forest. A man, or something that resembled a man, standing impossibly still. His outline was blurred, shifting, as though he were part of the very darkness itself, merging with the trees around him. The same man from before, his face obscured by matted hair and dirt. His eyes glowed, just like the cow's, just like the unnatural presence that had followed Callum ever since he had entered the clearing. But this was different. Now the figure was not alone. Behind him, another presence took shape. A faint outline, a figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a reflection in broken glass. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally long, like they didn't belong to this world at all. Callum's heart pounded in his chest, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. He wanted to scream, to run, but something held him in place. Something in the air, something invisible that rooted him to the earth. The figure moved again, this time closer, dragging its long limbs through the underbrush with a soft, sickening scrape that sent a shiver down his spine. The air thickened, The tension, the presence of something unnatural and ancient, hung heavy in the forest like a suffocating fog. Callum could feel it now, the weight of the forest pressing down on him with every breath. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled roots twisting like veins beneath the earth. The figure, or whatever it was, stood motionless now, staring at him with those glowing eyes. The silence broke. A low, guttural hum rose from the earth, vibrating through Callum's bones. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had not spoken in centuries, something that had slumbered beneath the forest for as long as time itself. The trees shook, the ground trembled, and for a brief moment, Callum felt the weight of an overwhelming presence. That same force that had made the cow twist into something monstrous, that same force that had driven the figure to this place. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The hum faded into the silence, the air clearing as if nothing had ever happened. The figure was no longer there. The eyes dimmed, leaving nothing but the weight of the forest's breath on Callum's skin. But the forest had changed. He could feel it. The wind had stopped, the rustling of leaves had ceased, and in the eerie quiet, a new sense of presence lingered. Callum turned quickly, his breath shallow, his body aching from the intensity of what he had just experienced. The forest, the land around him, had shifted. Its very nature had changed. The weight of the land now pressed upon him, pressing in on his chest, as though it had grown more aware of his presence. As he stumbled away from the clearing, back toward the distant safety of the ranger station, Callum knew one thing for certain: the forest would never let him go. It was watching, and it always had been.